When I first say this to men, talk about the sacrifice thing and the king, they say it sounds masochistic, but it's not got anything to do with masochism. Because the idea is not to suffer needlessly. The idea is to accept what suffering is necessary. See, here's a rule about men as opposed to boys. Men do what is necessary. They do what is necessary. They don't do it because they like the sacrifice that they have to make, but they do it for cosmos. They do it because their existence and cosmos in their experience cannot be separated. Look what we do in the modern world. We're into this modern fantasy. It's fascinating. We actually have got into the idea that you can be a man without giving a shit about the world.
Welcome to the second lecture on the King Archetype by Dr. Robert Moore, an internationally recognized Neo-Jungian psychotherapist and consultant specializing in men's psychology. Dr. Moore will delve into the concept of sacrifice as an essential aspect of the King Archetype, emphasizing the willingness to accept necessary suffering and act responsibly for the greater good. The conversation will also touch upon the transformative power of blessings and the role of the true King in offering blessings to others, as symbolized in the baptism of Jesus. Join us as Dr. Robert Moore delves into the depths of masculine psychology, offering invaluable perspectives on the King Archetype within you and its profound influence on personal growth and empowerment.
Welcome to everyone. Is there anyone here tonight that wasn't here last week? Okay. Well, I can't really take the time to go over all of the things, but I would like to just highlight a few key points. If you don't understand it, maybe you can get a tape, and if that doesn't help, I wouldn't be surprised. But anyway, last week I talked about a geography of the psyche and the importance of the uniqueness of Jung's ideas on the objective psyche, the collective unconscious, and the radical difference Jung's thought makes for you if you really think he's right. I'm here because I think he's right. And I like to say that I'm not a Jungian because I don't know anything else. I teach comparative psychoanalytic theory at the doctoral level. I was an Adlerian psychoanalyst before I was a Jungian psychoanalyst. My first book was a Freudian book. I continue to study at Freudian institutes and other places. I'm a Jungian today because I think it is far superior in terms of its comprehensiveness and adequacy to the human personality. There are things that Jungian psychology needs to borrow from other schools of thought, and we are not ashamed about borrowing. We do it a lot. It's one of the things about Jung. He always prided himself on the fact that he was a Freudian analyst and used Adler's ideas a lot. So what I'm saying to you is that there's a reason to set up oneself to study Jung's ideas in depth. And it has to do with this concept of the objective psyche. It has to do with the understanding that Jung had that there is a radical difference in your personality, and we're going to get extensively into this tonight. There's a radical difference in your personality between what he called the self with a capital S, which I like to make clear to everybody. We're not talking about your little s self here. This is not the self of the self-psychologist. The Freudian psychoanalytic self-psychologists are talking about a little s self. Maybe some people, some theorists think it may be somewhere intermediary between Jung's archetypal self and the Jung's concept of ego. I personally think that Kohut's little s self is the Jungian. I don't think there's any meaningful distinction that can be made between them. That's the elephant shit for those of you who are interested in comparative psychotherapeutic theory. Forgive us the rest of it. Key idea in centrist Jungian psychology. Let me make clear, this is not post-Jungian, whatever that is. This is not a point of view known today as archetypal psychology, because if you'll find that in so-called archetypal psychology, they have lost the sense of an archetypal self. That's their right. That makes them theoretically Adlerians. That's fine with me. I got lots of good friends who are Adlerians. Hello, Harold Mozak and Bernard Schulman. But that makes them Adlerians. They lose the fundamental contribution of Jung. The fundamental contribution of Jung is his understanding that within the psyche, there is this thing which is larger than life, it's larger than you, and it would like to get into you, whether you like it or not. It would like to have you all sorts of ways, and usually does. The Christians used to talk about this a lot before we became theologians that don't talk about symbolism. They talked about it in terms of the theology of incarnation. The whole idea about God becoming human. Well, you know, that may be, as some folks think, complete garbage, metaphysically, philosophically, theologically, but psychologically, it is a powerful image of what Jung was talking about. And as I said last week, get Edward Ettinger's book, Ego and Archetype. In that book, he goes into all this in depth, which I don't have time to do tonight. But there's a sense, he talks about Christ as the paradigm of the individuating ego. That says it. Christ as the paradigm of the individuating human ego. Okay. Now, what I want to do tonight is to put some more flesh on that, more than Ettinger has done, because he wasn't elaborating the archetypal nuances in this thing like we're trying to do in this series of courses on king, warrior, magician, and lover. All of these archetypal configurations are in the archetypal self. Now remember, last week we said you can think about the totality of the archetypal self deep within you as a couple. You can see it in Jung's books on alchemy, the Mysterium Conjunctionis, the royal alchemical couple within, the king and queen. That is an image of the deep self in every person. The female ego, the key to the female ego lies in the queen side in my book. The key to the masculine ego, to developing your masculine ego, lies in the king side of the archetypal self. You follow that? I'm just giving you the structure of it, the way I understand it. Okay. Yes.
Classical Jungian say that it lies in the contrasexual, like for the man and the anima.
Yeah. What is it?
The key.
The key. I think that a lot of the classical Jungians would say that, and as I would say, that the connection with the archetypal feminine is extremely important. The capacity to relate to the archetypal feminine is extremely important. See, the anima, we talk a lot, the anima this, the animus that. In my book, all they're talking about is the archetypal masculine and the archetypal feminine. The anima is an expression of the archetypal feminine, not the human feminine. And a man, in order to grow up, has got to get clear of that distinction. If he cannot distinguish between the archetypal feminine and human women, he will never have a decent relationship with one. And the reverse is true. Okay. So I don't want to get into a lot of the explication of the anima as the archetypal feminine, but that would be the way I would go. I would go pretty much with Bolin, except I wouldn't use goddesses. I would talk about the queen, etc., just like in a parallel way to these four. Okay. Christ as the paradigm of the individuating ego. Now, the assumption there is that in the archetypal self is a map for the human male. And I would not say that Christ is a paradigm for the individuating female. It's where I differ from Eddington. I think Christ, and feminist theologians would understand what I mean about this. Christ, you see, Christ is a word that means king. The word Christ has no meaning outside of the Hebrew messianic traditions. The Messiah is a king. So when you try to get into that Christian symbolism about Christ, read that king. Once you do that, then you can understand that symbolism in a way that you would never be able to understand it without understanding the king archetype. I'm going to go into it more tonight. If I were discussing theology tonight, you'd say, my God, he's got an incredibly high Christology. But I'm not talking about theology. I hope you will go home tonight and say, my God, he's got an incredibly high anthropology. That is, we're talking about masculine potentials tonight. Potentials, not our reality that we live in. We're talking tonight about things masculine that men touch and men glimpse and sometimes men embody. But since this is an archetypal reality, they can never possess it. A man can never own it. He identifies with it only at the risk of psychosis. And he loses touch with it at enormous risk to his soul, namely chronic depression and aimlessness. So when you're reading Edgar, I hope you'll hear me whispering in your ear saying, now remember, this is Christ as the paradigm of the individuating male ego, not female ego. That's the fight that the feminists have with Christian theology. They are absolutely right. Absolutely right. Psychologically, I don't know anything about those. But you see, when you don't fill out the feminine imagery in a spirituality, you cripple little girls. And when you don't fill out the masculine imagery when you're dealing with spirituality, you cripple the little boys. And that's why I've got a lot, let me say this clearly here, that's why I have a lot of trouble with those people that want to strip all the masculine imagery out of spirituality discussions. Because that imagery is loaded with psychological reality for men. Not for women as much, but for men. Okay, now, it's appropriate to talk a little bit about the sort of the psychology of Christ as the paradigm of the individuating ego, Because if you will notice here, are we out of chairs? Let's see if we can get some more. If you'll notice here, what I'm going to be talking about is the way in which these qualities of the sacral king in history are potentials within every man's psyche. And I say they're potentials because they are there as energy sources, they're there as circuitry, they're there as ways of accessing energy and channeling it, or as the Jungians love to say, canalizing it, directing this energy, getting the energy, and then not being destroyed by it. So let's look at these. I'm just going to run through them before our break. And then we'll take a short break. And then after the break, we can, I want you to be thinking, those of you that got to watch the movies I suggested that you watch, King David and Camelot and anything else on kingship, we can discuss it as a way of elaborating. But let me go through these four things. What the king archetype within a man is for, what it's there for. Now remember, it's not there for everything in terms of this configuration. See, in the mythology, remember last week I said in the mythology of the gods, whether it's Christ or Allah or Yahweh or Buddha, so forth, Shiva, Krishna, these four functions, the king, the warrior, the magician, and the lover, are held together in the deity. And only when you're seeing just one facet of the jewel of the deity do you see the king, or the warrior, or the magician, Shiva the sorcerer, or Shiva the erotic lover. You're turning the jewel. But in the imagery of the traditions, Shiva is all these things together in a great jewel. And Buddha is all these things together in a great jewel. And Christ is all these things together in a great jewel. So in the same sense that in the deepest part of the self, all these four functions are integrated, just in the mature individuated man, to the extent that is humanly possible, these four configurations would be integrated. Be a hell of a man. Now, we laugh about that, but there have been a lot of men who were hell of men. Men that were admirable and deserved at least to be admired when we're trying to seek out this issue of developing these potentials. I had a method in my madness by asking you to look at King David. It is said by some scholars that the image of God in the Hebrew tradition is based on David. And if you read the Psalms and you study the life of David, you get a sense for why some people today, and I agree with them, think that men ought to study David. I was going to say to you tonight, now if you're Jewish, I want you to go home and study David. And if you're not Jewish, I want you to go home and study David. Because he integrates as a man in his imperfect way, in his flawed ways, a passionate dancer, warrior, sorcerer, king of a man. So it's possible to integrate a lot of these things for men. And there are a lot of men that are about doing it. But let me go into this one configuration. Now remember, this is not all of them. And next week I'm going to talk about what happens to you when you shoot up with this, to the exclusion of the other aspects of the archetypal potentials. If you get into this without having enough lover, get into this without having enough warrior, you get into this without having enough magician. But now we're not talking about pathology tonight, so I'll say some things about it, but don't expect me to give you the dark side tonight for this thing. Okay? Okay, creating cosmos. Now, again, remember last week I pointed out that in the archetypal psyche, in the deep part of the psyche, in the psychic geography, there is no world without the king. In the male psyche, there is no world. That is to say, there is chaos. There is lack of order, and what order that exists is not just. Remember, I talked about how the person of the king in the archetypal vision, there's not distinguishable from the Tao. It's not distinguishable from the Dharma. The person of Yahweh is not distinguishable from Torah at that archetypal level. When the king appears, justice appears. That's the way it works at this level in the psyche. When the king appears, chaos is organized, but it's not an alienated order. See, the kind of we tend, because of our experiences with men, we tend to be like Robin Morgan. We tend to see them as all demon lovers, terrorists, what I like to call boy kings. What are men and boy kings and boy warriors? They create injustice and impose it tyrannically upon others with less firepower or less focused will. But that's if you don't understand these depths. And if you look at the epidemiology of masculinity, in other words, what is average does not mean it is normal. Okay, so when you hear all these people talking about peace with justice, fantasizing just peace, they're in this space. In other words, until this psychological entity is connected with in the masculine psyche, let me run through it. If you're out of touch with this, your warrior won't be a warrior, he'll be a mercenary. A warrior without a chief is a mercenary. Selling himself. Well, we call that other things. A magician without connection with this will be what Plato considered the sophist to be. Knowledge for hire. If you got the money, we'll give you dialysis. If you don't, we got our own version of this analysis. You can afford to pay what? Well, I can see that you really are more of a candidate for a brief site. The local mental health center. That's based in the theory. Think about that. See, when you write psychological theory and clinical psychological protocols and ethics, and you have no connection with the king, then you rationalize greed under the guise of theory. The Marxist social critics, I'm not a Marxist, don't get me wrong, but the Marxist social critics know some stuff. And they know the way in which, when the men running the care systems of a culture are out of touch with this, they're mercenaries. You know, nothing wrong with being a mercenary if you know you're a mercenary and you know what that means. I've been known to read Soldier of Fortune magazine. That's a good joke. Those of you who don't read it, I say. Okay. But the point of it is, if you're not in touch with this, your lover will be a rapist. Now, it may not be bizarrely a rapist, but it will have that same unempathic, uncaring expression. And the basic way your lover will express itself is in longing to be loved. See? Well, you know, when am I going to find a woman that can really appreciate me? You know, a lot of country songs on this. We're looking for it, and Willie found it. She lay down beside me and touched me as if I were gold. Okay, so I want you to be thinking about that. This deep potential in a man functions, in my view, like a circuit. And we don't get mad at computers. Well, we do get mad at computers, but if the thing is down, we know it's down. We do what is necessary to get it up. Right? Well, when the king circuitry is down, let's don't just start attacking IBM for the fact that they don't make a computer that can handle this program. So let's do what we can to get it up. And the good news about Jungian psychology is that this thing is in there. It's not some fantasy of the Marxist romantics or the Christian apocalyptic messianic idiots. This thing is in the psyche. And if I was lecturing on the Queen, I'd be talking about that side, because that's in the psyche too. That is, you know, one of the reasons that the Orthodox Jews would not accept Jesus as the Messiah is because a lot of the ways in which Christ was represented to them was in ways in which he was powerless to start effecting this kind of change in history. Because if you're coming out of a Jewish messianic ideal, when the Messiah comes, that starts. Period. You don't argue about it or theologize about it. It's not a matter of theological niceties. When Messiah comes, this starts. And it seems to me that the psychology of this business helps us to understand a little bit about that, because this kind of thing in a man, when that's connected with the capacity to become, you know, you've studied this, those of you that study developmental psychology, when Erik Erikson is talking about generative man, this is what he's talking about. He doesn't talk archetypal psychology, but he's talking about the king potential in a man. There's an excellent meta-theoretical treatment of all this for those of you that pride yourselves on reading hard books. It's Don Browning's book by that title. Don S. Browning from the University of Chicago entitled Generative Man. And he outlines the sort of the assumption and ethics underlying this kind of potential in the psyche. Now, what am I saying here? Let's be sure. I'm saying that when a man starts to get initiated and mature, he starts connecting with this thing. And he finds himself capable for the first time in his life of giving a damn about things that are not merely egoistic, that are not merely things which are self-aggrandizing. He starts being concerned. He starts, well, you can read, this is what was behind a lot of that 1960s rhetoric. This archetypal imago was behind a lot of that. The capacity to start feeling your erotic connection with something other than somebody that you're exploiting sexually. Okay. So, caring in large letters, the capacity to care. A lot of this talk about caring. And usually, a lot of men have a lot of difficulty relating to that. Okay, what's this caring? Sounds soft. If you deal, again, with a lot of the images of Jesus that are put out by liberal Protestantism, you can understand why they're turned off. Because this kind of caring is not an asexual kind of caring. It's not an impotent kind of niceness. It's a very assertive, powerful, potent movement against the forces of chaos in the world. Let me go over that again. It is, I like to say, aggressive movement against the forces of chaos in the world. So, this is not talking about sending flowers toward it. This is about moving decisively against the forces of chaos in the world.
Last week you talked.
Yeah. Yes. The capacity for a man like Father Clemens, now whatever else he is, I'm sure, like all large men, he probably has a large shadow, excuse me, Father, but the thing that makes it possible for him to care enough about the children in his neighborhoods to risk his life repeatedly like he is right now is this. Aggressive. What you're seeing in Clemens is an archetypal reality, and it is that Messianic king. It was there in Martin Luther King. It was there in Gandhi. It's Satyagraha. You've heard of Truth Force. You can see it coming out. You see, we say, well, now that's the warrior. Well, but you got to understand. The warrior configuration in the masculine psyche does not do that unless it's grounded in this image. The warrior in your psyche will make you a wonderful, successful, sociopathic businessman. If it's not grounded in this. It will make you a magnificent killer, hitman, if it's not grounded in this. So, to be quite clear about the way this all works in the psyche, if the warrior configuration in a man is not grounded, centered in this, you don't really have a war. You got a mercenary. And they're as different as daylight and dark. I often say to men, I said in this warrior course we had, that there's no such thing as a warrior whose energies and whose commitments are private. A true warrior is always committed to the best in civilization as he knows it. That's what a warrior is by definition, always has been in human history. And so a lot of the people that we consider warriors today are boy warriors, either boy warriors or they're very highly competent, wonderfully, magnificently competent mercenaries. I mean, I got a lot of respect for some of the mercenaries I've known. Respect them as people that are highly competent, professionals. You know, they talk about the professional, that's a euphemism for hitman. And that's what a person that has got all of the arsenal and competencies of the warrior with none of the grounding in this. Okay. Now look at what comes next. This is the one that people don't like to hear about. Sacrifice. Because you start studying the king, and there's this interesting thing about the king. Archetypally, he's always sacrificed. In the Golden Bough, I suggest that you read the Golden Bough. In the Golden Bough, he's sacrificed whether he likes it or not. You know, when your time comes, they put you out there on the island, and they give you so much time, and then they send somebody to get you. The one that's going to succeed you. And your job is to stay alive as long as you can to keep him from catching you on the island. And it's like a bad Arnold, well, I started to say a bad Arnold Schwarzenegger movie. What was that other one? The Predator. Did you see The Predator? You know, it's kind of like Predator. You know, you've got the old king on the island and the new king lands. And the new king's got to kill the old king, take the crown. So it's kind of involuntary. In the Christian myth, you see a different variation on it. You get the willing in the apocalyptic, you get the willing sacrifice. See, in the old myths, Jesus is not killed against his will. This is a primordial apocalyptic sacrifice. And the real enemy, it's very interesting. See, archetypally, just forget the theology of it, just look at the myth itself. And you know this movie, The Last Temptation of Christ, if you watch that and think king, watch that movie and think king archetype, because that movie has got a lot better feel for the myth than most movies about. It's the best movie about Christ as myth that's ever been made, in my view. Because it's clear in that movie, the real enemy is not any of those humans. But it's real clear, he says, we're going to war. Takes his heart out of his chest, we're going to war. Now there it is right there. You see that? He takes his heart out of his chest, we're going to war. Who's the enemy? Satan. Who is Satan? Personification of chaos. See? That's who Satan always has been in all the myths. Personification of chaos and death. So, but it's a self-sacrifice. There's the action right there. And there is the sacrifice, not the crucifixion scene. You follow that? You see that? Okay. In that scene, takes his heart out. We're going to war. See, there is the moment. It's like, you know, it's like all the men that have been in this configuration are already dead before they start their work. You get it? You got to work on that. It's what Kierkegaard talks about. A knight of faith is one who lives as if he were already dead. This is the sacrifice. It is that thing which gets to the point to where something has dawned upon this individual that there are a lot of things more important than being alive. And they are willing to die for it. They are happy to sacrifice for it. They don't want to die. Father, let this cup pass from me. See, that bit, it's not a masochistic. See, when I first say this to men, talk about the sacrifice thing in the king, they say it sounds masochistic, but it's not got anything to do with masochism. Because the idea is not to suffer needlessly. The idea is to accept what suffering is necessary. See, here's a rule about men as opposed to boys. Men do what is necessary. They do what is necessary. They don't do it because they like the sacrifice that they have to make, but they do it for cosmos. They do it because their existence and cosmos in their experience cannot be separated. Look what we do in the modern world. We're into this modern fantasy. It's fascinating. We actually have got into the idea that you can be a man without giving a shit about the world. It's real interesting. You know, that idea did not exist in the human race until modernity. And think about that. Think back on that. That idea did not even exist in the human race until the modern world, after myth collapsed. Study any tribe, any tribal culture. Study initiation in any tribal culture. You will find that the definition of being an adult male has to do with participating in that. There's no such thing as a pre-modern culture that's not a warrior culture in that sense. In that sense, in the men's responsibility for maintaining just worlds. Think about that, that's scary. So it is not masochism, has nothing to do with masochism. You get masochistic when you make your tie with the king unconsciously. You know, that's the Messiah complex. You've got all these people that are going to suffer for their dysfunctional families, right? Think about the adult children of alcoholics literature. Think about all that we've learned lately about dysfunctional families. You know, in the dysfunctional family, you can be an incredibly gifted person. But the king and the queen abdicated or were tyrants. And so what do? Well, you take on the role of being the king or the queen. What does the king and queen do? They sacrifice for order. They sacrifice that the others may live. So we've got all kinds of people in the world who are in an unconscious identification with the king, archetype, or the queen, or women. And they're giving their lives that others may live, but they're doing it in a masochistic way. It's not conscious.
And the key thing is they're identifying with the archetype.
Yes, they don't know it. See, anytime you don't... See, look, my argument, and I think it's clearly Jung's argument, is either you're consciously connected to these things or you're acting them out at some. There's not an option between them. Either you have formed a relationship with these realities so that you're clear you're not it, but you're trying to get an optimum distance with it, or it's acting out in some way in you. And so the masochistic personality trying to be enough order for their whole dysfunctional family is an unconscious tie with this thing, constantly trying to be enough for this family. But of course, that's not a human thing. That's an archetypal thing. You can't ever do what this archetype can do. You get it? I mean, this is an archetype, not a human. Humans can't do this. Archetypes can. You say, well, is that an ontological metaphysical reality? I don't know. As a psychologist, I could rap about it as a theologian. I mean, we could rap about all this stuff in We could speak myth together, and I like to do that, but we're not talking myth, we're talking psychology here tonight in terms of what this stuff is. But I do know one thing, if you try to be that archetype, you're going to die one way or the other. Slow or fast. And the problem with this thing is, and you notice this in people, when you get close to this, it tends to take you over. And once it gets you, when you get into this, it's kind of like, that those movies where you're flying along, getting pretty close to the Death Star, and pretty soon, it's got you. And it can take you right in on its beam without anything, no matter what you do with your engines, you can't stop it. That's the way an archetype is. So most of us stay away from these things as much as we can consciously because we know that you can lose your will to them. If you get into this thing, pretty soon, you start glowing. Decide you're going to run for office, right? You got pretty hair, then you decide, well, my God, I'm Gary Hart. Pretty soon you've got a lot of other people thinking you're the king. Oh my God, you seen him? Boy, did you hear him? Oh wow. Got a committee starts. And of course that feeds your narcissism and your grandiosity because everybody comes in and they're real uncomfortable with their king, so they project on you. Here, you hold this. I see you're ready for this. And then you just light up. See, and the more you light up, the more everybody notices in the room. Say, hey, you see that glow over there? I think there's a star up there. So pretty soon, he's having press interviews. And we say to him, there are rumors, sir, about the guests that you've been having in your Washington townhouse. And he says, what? He says, oh, that's ridiculous. Why don't you just put a tail on me? And then pretty soon he's over his inflation. Because the press is not interviewing the archetype. The press is interviewing the man. And the man that they tail and find out what he's up to is a human. And then his presidential campaign comes to an end. That's the way that works. And as I suggested to you last week, that's what happens when you get into this archetype and you name your administration Camelot. And then when you go down to Dallas in Texas, where all of us boys learn to shoot real well, you ride around in your convertible with the bulletproof top off after the Secret Service has told you somebody's out to get you. You know why we do that? Because when you're in this archetype, you're invulnerable. You can't kill an archetype. So this archetype is so powerful. Once you connect with it, if you're not real clear about Ettinger's thing about disidentification, not being the archetype, just relating to it, it will suck you right into it and then get you into mischief. And we'll talk about all the mischief you get into next week. Okay. Point. It's the archetype that has the undrainable energy. Let me get that with it. It is the archetypal thing within you that has all the energy, but it is not you, the human. And so when you are accessing this thing properly, it enables you to feel all kinds of things that you could not feel without it. It gives you immense energy sources. And this is why a person like Martin Luther King or Gandhi can go to such enormous lengths in the service of their cause without dropping. It does give them, it does serve as an energy source. And when the person has got means of regulating this thing, they can function a long time plugged into it. So it's not like it just, our fantasy a lot of the time is, my God, we talk about defenses against grandiosity a lot of the time in psychoanalysis. One of the defenses against the grandiosity is because we don't want to be overwhelmed. with responsibility. I'm going to say, I'm going to stay away from this sense of significance, because if I start thinking I'm significant, then I'm going to be overwhelmed with responsibilities. And you can see why that would be. This thing, however, gives a person a sense of resources to meet a lot of responsibility. So if a person is in a position that has a lot of responsibility for stewardship, then this energy is extremely important. Can you see that? Otherwise, burnout will. And go over it again. If you're in a position such as being a parent or being a therapist or being a boss, etc., which requires a lot of caring behaviors on your part, and you try to do that out of your ego alone, you may be able to do it for a while. But in a very short while, you're going to start feeling extremely depleted and resentful. And soon be distancing from the task at hand. You see that? According to a Jungian point of view, that's where this connection has to be made with the king stuff. You study the way in which Christian spirituality throughout the centuries has dealt with this. It's not just Christian spirituality, though. All you have to do is to look at most spiritualities in the world. Because human spiritualities have always been about putting persons in touch with this kind of energy without having them totally identified. You can see it in Islam, you can see it in Buddhism. For example, those of you that know something about Buddhism, you've heard of the Bodhisattva ideal. For those of you that haven't, the Bodhisattva is the person who has become enlightened and is therefore free of the wheel of rebirth. And technically speaking, does not have to come back to this world anymore. But because they have achieved something, what is it? In my book, it's this. They've achieved connection with this. They have developed the capacity to care about others that's not grounded on their personal interest. So the Bodhisattva returns to the world to help others until such time as everyone is liberated. What is that? That's the king archetype. That's the king archetype. Shouldn't surprise anybody. Buddha was a king. He was from a royal family. And it's quite clear that the Buddha nature is an image of the same psychological reality as the Christians talk about in the Christ within, or the Imago Dei. It's the same type of emotional resource. Okay. So you try to do it out of the ego like modern people do. Get together with a bunch of therapists. I'm not taking on any more borderlines. Borderline personality, by definition, to me, is someone who is very much out of touch with the king and queen within. They've got loads of archetypal energy, and their king and queen circuits are real shut down. What does that do? That makes you real passionate and real chaotic. It gives you a lot of firepower and real good aim. And therapists are scared of that. Okay, any questions before I go on? Let's see, we got a couple of minutes here before we take a short break. Any questions about this before I go on? You see how this works in terms of the structure of the way it works in the psyche? Okay. So in other words, this is what the transpersonal psychologist would call a transpersonal resource within the human psyche that the I of the human being has to make a connection with in order to get connection with this kind of energy. It must disidentify with it, because if you identify with it, the 220,000 volts fries you out, gets you killed. You don't want to identify with it. Yeah.
I've got a question for a matter of differentiation.
All right.
If it's the archetypal self that holds the energy,
yes,
then you have to identify with the king in order to tap the archetypal energy.
You can tap the archetypal energy through all of these configurations, you see.
But you have to identify with those configurations in order to tap that energy source.
Well, it's not very voluntary. Then let's put it this way: you will be connected if your personality is shaped around one or more of these configurations right now, and you're getting energy off of it right now. The key about the king is not that you can't get any energy anywhere else. You will get energy off of the lover if you're compulsively in the lover. You'll have a lot of energy, but you won't have any order and justice.
If you're identified with that.
Yeah, that's right.
Well,
yeah.
The disidentification is what allows you to move from king to lover.
That's right. And vice versa. That is, the disidentification. Remember, in the archetypal self, just as in the individuated ego, these things are held in a dynamic balance. They're not four things in the deep self, and they're not four things in the individuated male ego.
They express themselves in unique and specific.
That's right. Appropriately to context. That's right. You got it. Okay. Yeah.
What happens with an individual that's farther from the human? You need to mainline that. What's the process?
It's real interesting to think about why an individual tends to have a tremendous rush of one particular configuration of archetypal energy. My theory about that, and we'll just have to have other people experiment with it in their own lives and their own work. My theory about that is that the archetypal energy that configurates and comes on strong with you in your regret is where you were most hurt in your childhood. In other words, think about it in terms of Jung's principle of compensation. The human self always has walls. You can use it metaphorically. Your human self or your human ego's got places where the walls are real good and solid and places where they're like paper mache. The places where yourself is real thin and weak is where you tend to turn into the archetype when you get in trouble. And like, for example, if you find that you fly into rages and become very violent, then the place in your psyche in your human ego that needs a lot of work is your warrior. In other words, contrary to a lot of people's understanding of this, real warriors never lose their temper. They get angry, but they don't get so enraged they can't do the job. That's what the Iceman cometh. All that stuff about the Iceman, the person that is coldly efficient when they're doing their warrior job, that is not rage in the sense that we talk about this stuff. It's not losing it. If you lose your temper a lot, you got to work a lot on warrior. You know, I frighten people with that. They send me a guy that tends to be violent. I say, you need to study martial arts. Because if a man can't handle his power, he needs to get closer to it. And he needs to get familiar with it, and he needs to take responsibility for it. And the same thing, I think, would work in other areas. If you tend to move into the schizoid position, You know, if you tend to move away from people, detach, get very into books a lot when you regress. See? You can see all sorts of things that's compensating. See? But you think compensatorily about these things. In this king thing, if you become a tyrant a lot over people, you're probably longing for some experience of a generative person. I've studied a lot about sadomasochism. And I think a lot of people that really get into sadomasochistic acting out are really looking for someone that they can submit to that will not enter the repetition compulsion. The repetition compulsion to be in a sadomasochistic pattern is just acting out an old trauma. They're looking for someone to submit to. The will to submit is not a pathological thing, because it's really this thing that one is needing to do some submission with, get some sense of serving this kind of reality and this kind of center in the psyche. Other comments or questions? Yeah.
If you had to sum up in a sentence what sacrifice is, when you say it's accepting, like you said, accepting what suffering is necessary?
Yeah. I like to say that boys have rights, men have responsibilities, and they do what is necessary coming out of this thing. Now, any man who is struggling to be a father does this all the time. I mean, he's not doing it archetypally, perhaps, or perfectly, but he's struggling to embody a lot of this, and this is exactly what his children are trying to project on him. And the whole idea of the good enough father that people talk about is a man who is able to access and let some of this energy flow through him, enough of it so that the kid, when they're projecting that on him, can get enough of it for it not to be one of these dysfunctional families. That is, so that the kid can feel that somehow in my father there is a combination of power and goodness. Not perfectly, but somehow in my father, there's this combination of power and goodness that issues in a kind of caringness beyond his own narcissism. That's what a child is. Now, it's very interesting. I love to look at the permutations of this stuff in history. Even a man who, a lot of people are suspicious of power. You hear a lot of raps about power today in the academic world. Very few of them have anything good to say about power. It's very interesting. But even a man with as much realism about the importance of power as Reinhold Niebuhr, one of the greatest thinkers of the 50s and 60s in the United States, man still studied a lot in political science departments. Pointed out that you study the human traditions and you see this messianic ideal. And what he was talking about is this part of the king archetype. He didn't know that he was talking about the king archetype. He just thought he was talking about the messianic ideal in Christianity, but it is in all these different cultures. About the tendency of the archetype to seduce you into inflation. That's what they're talking about there. But that's not what people get out of that. A lot of people get the idea that a man should not want power because if he becomes powerful, he must, of necessity, become an obnoxious asshole. That is puer philosophy and puer psychology. And as long as we have that attitude toward power and the stewardship of power, this planet will continue being in the mess it's in now. Because what you get is a lot of people that want to disidentify with power. They don't want power. They don't want responsibility. They don't want power. Because I don't want to be like my daddy. My daddy was an abusive SOB. He's the result, he's the cause of my stuff, so I'm not going to have any power. Men all over the country, all over the world, I think, have got two models that they operate out of. Neither one of them operating with this archetype. They either think that if I have power, I will be abusive like my father and other men. So I can decide I'm going to be abusive or I'm going to be powerless. And if you look around and you talk to men, and talk to especially to boys in our culture, particularly in our urban culture, that is the image you get that is being sold a lot by the media. You're either powerless and a victim, or you're powerful and a sadist or an abuser. That shows how we are in what the Hopi call Kianaquatse. Whenever you get to the point when your idea that a man, when empowered, is only an antisocial killer, then you get what we're getting in our cities now. Yeah.
That's kind of undifferentiated reality. Not so much that it's an undermining of legitimate power.
That's right.
Okay, by inferior people who are afraid of their power.
Well,
who are afraid to affect change through power.
Yeah. Well, see, anytime you get, that's the stewardship. When we come back after break, that's the stewardship issue there, see. This word is a very large word in human psychology. You wouldn't know it by looking at contemporary psychology. But there are few words that should loom larger than the word stewardship. And it has to do with what one is responsible for doing with these potentials, including this power potential. So that's what you're getting at there, and I think you're absolutely right. The issue is not, well, I'm going to be more ethical if I don't have any power. Fact is, people without power, I don't think are a bit more ethical than people with it. They just have less capacity to do damage. So we'll come back and we'll talk about stewardship and then get to the real issue, which is blessing. Let's take about 15 minutes. So, stewardship idea, and again, if you want to read very extensive kind of treatments of this kind of thing in psychoanalysis, the place to look is really in the mature writings of Erik Erikson. Erik Erikson, in an uncanny way, was studying this stuff. And he embodied it more than he placed it in an archetypal context. You can almost say Erik Erikson, this great Freudian psychoanalyst that had no college degrees at all, embodied a lot of this stuff in his own life. And there's a book about him by Robert Coles entitled Erik Erikson, The Growth of His Work, which is a good thing to read about these virtues of caring and generativity. But the traditional word which has been used throughout history, and the idea that you find when you study tribal cultures, if you study, for example, all this interest in Native American culture, one of the main reasons why people are so interested in it is because, think about it, if you're going to think ecology, what do you have to think? Stewardship. What it's about. You are one who cares for, one who is capable of being responsible for. And of course, the New Testament and Christian traditions are full of this image. A lot of the parables deal with this. Now, the word stewardship, however, is really good for, in terms of this archetype in another way, because it helps to get a differentiation between the human ego and the archetypal king, the human man and the archetypal king. Because, as we said last week, if you notice, as the idea of kingship and the practice of kingship develops in the world throughout history, gradually the king gets clear, aha, I am a king, but I am not the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And gradually you get this differentiation between the historical king and the king God. And you can look at the iconography. By the way, remind me to get some brochures for you, or at least get more information for you on this iconography of the king exhibit. Little Jungian synchronicity here. Just as soon as our course is over, I'm going to invite all you people down to Hyde Park to the Oriental Institute. On November, I think the 11th, they're going to have a day-long presentation on iconography of the king. You come down and look at this, the slides, and listen to the lectures on that. You will be the only people there that think this has got anything to do with today. But anyway, in some of those old images of the king, you get the sculpture of the king kneeling before the God, king. And in some of the images, the throne is really empty. And so you get this idea of the earthly king being clear that he is not the king. He is responsible to the king. You see this really clearly in the Parsifal myth. And if you're opera fans, you can get at this stuff by looking at Parsifal, the opera Parsifal. And if you're not opera fans, you can get at this through looking at opera Parsifal. You can get one with English subtitles. Read the libretto. Because in that, you've got the story of every man's struggle with this. We start off being a little Parsifal, trying to be faithful to mom, not having anything to do with other women, not knowing our name. Mom saying, stay away from those nights. They'll get you into trouble. So the boy works his way through all sorts of adventures and so forth until he gets to the point of realizing that the whole thing has been about his becoming the king. The whole thing is a mystery of kingship in a man. And toward the end, he heals and blesses the old king. Think father. He assumes his kingship, and he understands who it is that the Grail serves. See, the Grail serves the Grail king, who is not the human king. It's God. See. So in that whole myth, you get this archetypal structure. You get the importance of the ego disidentifying with this archetype so that the ego can have some sense of stewarding. The word means what? Give me a sort of a literal definition of to steward. What is to steward? What does that mean? To manage and serve. All of the above. It has the general meaning, the same meaning of to care for another. It is not ownership.
Steward provide bounty.
Yes. Prunes too. All sorts of things. The idea is that you do not, this is not ownership, this is not possession, this is taking care of for someone. And see, there's where the ecology thing comes in terms of the, the ecological issues. If you have an idea that you own the planet, then it's impossible for you to muster the sense of reverence that you need to care for it. And so the idea of stewardship is something which helps an individual deal with their resources, material, emotional, intellectual, all sorts of things. Yeah, comments, question, yeah.
Stewardship, I know you're not implying taking care of or for in the sense of baby or not wrong.
No.
But
no. That really moves us on into this blessing idea. That is, to steward. The idea of stewarding is to help the most potential embody itself.
Did you call Mike Lisa?
Well, that's a loaded one, isn't it? You, Mike, I don't know what to say about this. This is on tape, man. To the extent that any coach is really, really good at it, there's a sense in which they better be a steward, because if they're not a steward, they will not be able to elicit the best from their players.
It may be his job as stewardship, not whether or not he fulfills it. That's another question.
Right. That's right. Any leader has signed on to be a steward. They may not know that, or there may be an empty word for them. But the problem is you get so many people signing on to be leaders whose circuitry and this stuff is down. For whom the word stewardship is an empty word that has no meaning. The narcissistic personality disorder is incapable of rocking this word. It's like it's from another planet. It's language from another planet. And they can only trivialize it. And they can't help it. Because if you're a narcissistic personality disorder, and all of us have got some narcissistic pathology, it's because somebody that had a stewardship responsibility with you didn't come through for you when you were very weak and vulnerable. Yeah.
I get a sense that stewardship doesn't have the same kind of power. That it seems to be more of the self-actualized thing in the creative cosmos idea and the idea of sacrifice. And that stewardship seems to power stewardship.
It doesn't. It's not as sexy. Because, when you really get into the job of creating cosmos out of chaos, it isn't really as sexy when you're doing it as when you're looking at the archetype. See, when we're in the archetype, it's loaded with all that numinosity, but when you're dealing with the world, it seems awfully mundane.
This is more mundane.
Well, it is not more mundane at all. I know it's not more mundane at all, but when you're into it, see, we're talking about the work end of it, not the glory end of it. See, this is more the work end of it. And this is also related to the sacrifice part, see? Because that's why people would rather go down in flames and get a lot of attention than they had to kind of do what is necessary day by day. Because doing what is necessary day by day is not near as sexy it's going down in flames and having everybody watch the contrail as you go down, heroically. Yeah, right.
I was going to say, the reason I said boundaries is that stewardship, let's say in agricultural business, the steward is someone who farms that land without pleading.
Yeah.
Okay. And yet, an inferior kind of steward goes out there and produces everything, drains everything out of the land until it becomes barren.
That's right.
Or the same thing with an industrialist in the material way, produces a product, and instead of the cost of the toxic waste and taking care of that toxic waste and put it in the product, he dumps it someplace in order to maximize the line.
Absolutely.
So stewardship is not just in the doing, but is in the boundaries of how it's done.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. That whole boundary issue is very important. I mean, it's like being able to extend the boundaries of you're really talking about extending the boundaries of your responsibilities to the place where they really stop. And it's like if I'm dumping toxic waste on African tribes, as it's happening today, we're exporting a lot of our toxic waste to Africa and other places where where bribery works very well to be able to dump truckloads of toxic chemicals out in the outback areas, various parts of the world. We're doing that a lot now. That's a good example of what's happening. And the interesting thing is that we've created a climate where a guy who thinks he's a real hotshot man can really get off on doing that kind of stuff and be celebrated in the press a lot, by a lot of individuals. So that kind of gives you a little sense about the climate for stewardship. But I think it is not very sexy because it's like this is where the work is. This is where day by day people have to do what is necessary to engage these things, and it isn't real sexy. It's real ugly. Yeah.
And the steward is also to husband.
Yes.
For one of that verb thing comes now.
Which one now?
To husband. Yes.
Oh, that was the meaning of husbanding. Yes. And again, the interesting thing is, what that has come to connote in the sense of it has come to mean sort of like disempowerment. But I think the linguistic context of that word is the same one. And I think men ought to think about that in relationship to the concept of being a husband. Empowerment, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, in the story of His Fullness,
yes.
The little boy is asked by Iron John to guard his cause.
Yes.
Is that an act of
sort of a training thing, isn't it? And of course, the boy can't do that. He gets too excited. It's what we call in psychoanalysis overstimulation. See, you got this gold stuff in here, all this archetypal energy in there, and that little fountain, and the boy has got to put his finger in it, just out of curiosity. But of course, there's probably something evolutionary about that. We want the Prometheus myth, we want to get into this archetypal energy here. But that's an interesting insight. I never heard anybody say that, and I think that's got some merit to think about. And it's not that, he doesn't get killed because of it. He just has to go on out and do more things. He's got to have more experiences where he has to engage with his power. He's got to go out. How many of you read that? Iron John, or have read it? Watch what happens in that. The boy gradually has to get more and more comfortable with what?
Which comes guard.
Yeah. Cook's helper.
Cook's helper.
And notice how in that story he's very ashamed of his power and his beauty. This was where Robert Bly really has done wonderful. And Robert Bly is always trying to help men understand that their power and their beauty, their gold, he calls it, is scary. You got to be careful how and when you show it. You don't show your gold carelessly, because you're likely to provoke envy attacks and all sorts of other negative responses before your warrior self. Robert, excuse me for a little interpretation here. Before your warrior self can protect you. It's dangerous to feel your own beauty and power until you got enough of your warrior self so that the people that hate you for being beautiful can't kill you. But let's take it on with that. See, what happens, watch it. He meets this woman, see. It's a very interesting image of healthy woman in this story. She's not at all offended by his beauty and his power. It's really wonderful story in that respect. She wants him to take his cap off. Come on, guy. Take your cap off and let me see your golden hair. And he's scared of it. Gradually, he keeps going back to the forest, connecting with that, talk about, Robert's always talking about that wild man. Well, this is the wild man. The archetypal self is the wild man, non-domesticated, can never be domesticated. And gradually, notice what happens, though. When that wild man really gets liberated, what is he? He's a king. And the clue is, what comes out of the shadow? When the boy becomes a king, the shadow emerges as the king. The king is liberated when the boy becomes a man. That is the heart of that story with regard to this archetype. See, you can work that fairy tale. It's no wonder that Robert has really made that thing world famous. Because you can work that thing to understand the dynamic relationship of all these archetypes. You can see it in that one fairy tale. Yeah.
And then God.
Yes. That's right. Well, it's a whole story of redemption. That is a fairy tale of redemption. And what we're talking about, what we ought to be talking about today, is redeeming these masculine potentials. They're down there at the bottom of the lake. And just as in that fairy tale, that power and goodness and generativity can be liberated for the world. And let me talk a little bit about blessing. And then we will. What time is it? Good. Yeah.
I just wanted to ask one question about stewardship.
Yeah.
There's almost a paradox here that the steward serves.
Yeah.
On the other hand, the steward is an aspect of the divine.
Yes.
And it's an aspect. That's wrong. That's right. Makes me think of Edinburgh and his respect for John's answer to Job. Absolutely. It's an interesting issue.
It's almost what you're getting at is this interesting thing about the way the ego feels when it's really in touch with the archetypal self. It doesn't feel real ordinary. And I don't mean a pathologically inflated ego. I mean a human male ego the way it was designed to be. Instinctually. That's what Robert Bly is getting at. He's going around telling all these men, hey, you better get in touch with the wild man. In effect, he's saying, that's your birthright. Well, this is what he's getting at, is when you really get in touch with this thing, and it's not wiping you out by pathological expressions, there's a certain luminosity about the man. You know, there's this book that I hope a guy can get published where he talks about King David. And he subtitled it, I love this subtitle, The Lion in Luster. The Lion in Luster. Luster. There's a sense of that glow about it. And there's a certain divinity about it. It's almost like once you get into that, you get this sort of Native American feeling about all of us creatures being part of a royal household. It's like there isn't any such thing as ordinary creatures. And that's kind of what that gets at. There's a certain kind of divination. You see that there are a lot of people that talk about that. Chardin, Teilhard de Chardin talks about that kind of thing. And the book of John in the New Testament really gets into that kind of thing. And so there's a sense in which you know what that is to me? That's just, you just get over your depression. You know, you're not depressed anymore. Once you're not depressed anymore, you feel a little bit like you're divine. Now, Christians have been talking about that a while, and there's a whole branch of theology now called creation spirituality. And doesn't fly very well at the Vatican. You got to read what Matthew Fox said about the Vatican and the dysfunctional family. He said it, I didn't. But anyway, that idea about creation spirituality is about this issue about how you feel when you get over your depression. It's like you really do feel like it's kind of the creation. Kind of beautiful and wonderful. Yeah.
We suggest a work by
Matt Fox, somebody that knows his work. Tell us the best one to start with.
The Original Blessing.
Original Blessing, wonderful. There's a whole lot of it.
It's one that I think connects a lot of the king and the steward and stuff that's talking about sacrifice and coming of the cosmic presence, right?
Yeah, now Matt Fox knows a lot. He's got a real sense for the way in which the goddess stuff, what I would call the queen stuff, relates to this. So I would want to hold up the importance of the king stuff and not see it all as patriarchal bullshit. Anyway, blessing. Original blessing. That's a good place for us to stop tonight. Original blessing. See, the king, the true king, is not so much into being blessed as he is into blessing. I wanted to make a little rap here about some of the misguided theology that we've seen throughout the centuries. There's this saying, and I know that John Calvin wouldn't like this interpretation. Probably didn't mean this. But you know the phrase sola deo gloria. Somebody translate that, some Latin scholar here. Give us a translation. Sola deo gloria. What's that mean? Sola deo gloria. Yes. Or the Protestants like to say, to God alone be the glory. Now get that now. Sound like a dysfunctional family to you? Get it? To Dad alone be the glory. Or to Mother alone be the glory. What are we for? Well, we're supposed to adore them and tell them how wonderful they are, right? That's our role in the family. Anything we can do, kids, let's do it to make them get along, feel better. Let's make Mom feel better. Let's make Dad feel better. Let's protect Dad's narcissism. Sola Patri glory.
Every Hebrew prayer starts with blessed art thou.
Yes. Well, right, exactly. That's what I'm wanting to talk about. Because I think the true king doesn't function that way at all. The true king says, to the creatures be the glory. And if you look at the Gospels, that's the image of the king you get in the Gospels. You get the idea, the Christian idea of kenosis. What's that about? Well, you can do the theology of it, but the psychology of it is that when you disidentify with the archetype of the king and you make a connection with it, then you're able to let other people be blessed with your power. Your potency leads you to be able to empower other people so that they can feel like they glow. And if you're an executive and your people working with you don't feel like they're a little magical, you're not doing the job. You know what? I hate to tell you this. That was the good news. Here's the bad news. You're not making as much money as you could be making. See? You know, a lot of these people think, you know, in management think, well, you know, if I really ride them, they'll work harder.
That's my favorite.
See? Yeah, he could probably stand to study this stuff. Where would it go? Because there are a lot of coaches, and he wasn't the first. Look, he learned this from a long line of coaches. They go all the way back to Newt Rockman. Yeah. The idea, and you know, we get it a lot in the idea that we have that if you humiliate somebody enough, it'll really make them grow up. You know, the idea that the real way to help a man be a man is just to shame the hell out of it. You know? There's a lot of that stuff around. Yeah.
When we go through Ranger School, what they do is that humiliation is to get you disidentify with whatever you identified with before you came in. And then that NCOC stands up there and glows like God and says, now you want to be God, you come be like me. See? So Ditka, you know, you can look at Ditka in a negative sense, or you can look at him in a positive sense. You know, what he projects to media, I would say, is a very negative kind of coaching. But what he projects to his men doesn't necessarily happen.
Well, in any particular, you know, I never got. I'm not on the inside of any of that stuff. I just know that what you gotta get to is that what you do when you shame men unnecessarily is you make for a lot of very rageful, dangerous boys. See, that's something that I don't think has been understood very well. There is a certain necessary shaming. I say that and a lot of people get all upset when I say there is a necessary shaming. There's healthy shame. And that's what occurs when you realize what an arrogant, narcissistic, pompous ass you are. That's a healthy shame, and that's what Rudolf Otto talked about in the book Das Heilige, the encounter with the holy, because when you encounter the truly sacred, you feel shame, and it's not a phony shame, because what is exposed is the truth about you. You experience the truth about you. They used to talk about that as conviction in the old days. See, now that's the mysterium tremendum, mysterium fascinans. Yes, what were you going to say?
I'm wondering if that shame is not things like humility.
Oh, yes, I think that's right. That is true humility, because true humility consists not in being self-effacing and denying your gifts, like a lot of people think it is. True humility is knowing your limitations, so that once you get to know your limitations, then you'll get the help that you need to deal with it. And the person that needs some true necessary shaming experiences is a person that does not know their limitations, and life is going to encounter them with them. You can see everyone, the puer and the puella in us, and we've all got it. is avoiding some necessary shaming experiences. See, there's a lot of people talking about shame today in psychology that think that all shame experiences are pathology. They're just really, that's ridiculous. But most of the shame we have to deal with is pathological, because we're dealing with other people's narcissistic pathology that they're shaming us unnecessarily. In other words, a lot of people shame us for things we don't need to be shamed. Like in dysfunctional families, shame is the law. And a lot of the time in a dysfunctional family, you're being shamed for the very things you ought to be proud of. Yeah.
Distinguish one of the ways.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of great stuff coming out. There's a new book coming out by a man by the name of Morrison called "Shame: The Underside of Narcissism," and they're making some real strides now in understanding the plumbing of shame. But it's almost always related to other people. That is, the way you're feeling yourself. Well, it goes with people's eyes. Remember that old folk song about the guy that they were getting ready to hang him, and he said, "God damn your eyes, God damn your eyes." It is an experience of being defective, feeling defective in front of other people and having them know it. But it's a very complicated phenomenology. There's a book by Carl Snyder called "Shame, Exposure, and Privacy" that gets into this. People talk a lot about guilt as being transgressing one of your own internalized values, moral values, or something on that end. And a lot of people will talk a lot about shame cultures and guilt cultures and say that, traditional cultures are more shame cultures and ours is more of a guilt culture. I think that's a crock. I think all cultures are shame cultures. I think we all shame people just incredible. If you're a therapist and you're sitting with people a lot, you're just dealing with shame all the time. People ashamed of their beauty. In a dysfunctional family, you got to be ashamed of your beauty, because if you show it, you're going to get ridiculed, humiliated. Yeah.
Along that line, back to the Einstein story, the fascinating thing for me about the little boy was stewarding that, each time he did not do what he was told, and Iron John comes along and says, "Well, I understand, let's try one more time," and then finally, 3 times.
You're going to have to leave the forest. See, that forest is where a lot of people keep their gold. Really deep in the forest. And then gradually, as you get that befriending that powerful fella in there, you get where you show it more. I like to think that when I work with people, I want to create a bunch of shameless folks when it comes to other humans. See, they need to have a capacity for shame with regard to the archetypal dimension. But the healthier you get, the less vulnerable you will be to some crazy person shaming you, whether they're your boss or a committee member or a mentor or whatever. So blessing, see, is just the opposite of shaming. What the true king does is to invite people out, and seize them. The eyes are so important here. We haven't, here we are in almost the 21st century. And Erik Erikson's wife, as far as I know, is the only person that ever really did anything really interesting on eyes, psychology of eyes, the importance of eyes looking at you. Now, in the old culture, there's that book called The Evil Eye called Malocchio. There are books on the evil eye, but it's hard to get anybody to, until self-psychology recently talks about mirroring. You know, the whole concept in psychoanalytic self-psychology about mirroring, Self-Psychology and Clinical Social Work by Miriam Elson. Read that. But the word mirroring doesn't get it. It's not, the true king does not mirror you. The true king blesses you. If I hold up a mirror, that's too passive. It's too passive an image. Because the concept of blessing means that this king thing really constitutes your being and makes you feel more real and makes you feel more empowered. And the gaze of the king, in this blessing sense, sort of is constitutive. It's like you feel more real after you've been in his gaze for a while. It's very interesting to watch this in therapy. When this is present in the transference in therapy, the psychoanalysts call it a mirroring transference, mirror transference. And when a person has not received adequate blessing in their family, and they get into therapy, and they're able to form this king or queen transference with a therapist, for a day or two after they've been to see the therapist, they will feel a lot more alive. They will feel a lot better. They won't feel as depressed. They'll feel less chaotic. They'll feel more able to act. And after a day or two, it begins to sort of wear off. Why? Well, it has to do with this archetypal configuration. They haven't been looked at enough. Now, think about that. I want you to think about it. You know, Bernie Siegel is doing something which I just found out about just recently that I think is really wonderful. Bernie Siegel is a doctor that works with really sick people, cancer patients and stuff. He has them get undressed and in privacy and get in front of a large mirror and just look at themselves for long periods and try to see if they can find anything that they can like. And gradually, if they can find a place that they can like, to gradually widen the area of the body that the person can feel positive affect. That's directly related to this stuff. It's like, notice when you look in the mirror, notice how you act when you look in. When you go home tonight and you look in the mirror, notice how you act in the presence of your image. Notice how you feel when you're looking at yourself. To the extent that you didn't get enough of this king stuff mediated to you through the eyes of your father or other powerful men, and the correlate for women, you will feel very uncomfortable looking at yourself. It'll be very difficult for you to be with you there or to say anything positive to yourself. It's a fascinating thing, and there's probably a lot of research that needs to be done on this. I suspect that our body images that we see being so wounded in eating disorders and a lot of other kind of pathologies, I suspect that is directly related to not having been looked at in this way enough by anybody. Yeah.
We've gotten awfully far away from that and become easy.
Yeah.
In old historic cases, you can separate the neurological and psychological.
Yeah. Yeah.
Who the healer was made a difference.
Yeah.
Like that's
Yes. Yeah.
very much involved.
Yeah.
In the way that it's not generalized.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My research question for research psychology would be the question of whether that isn't generalizable. It's just whether we haven't gotten sophisticated enough to research a lot of that stuff. Because my guess is that if psychology gets better able look at this whole thing and you know, if there could, and I think a really good research psychologist could come up with research designs to test some of this mirroring stuff empirically. I think that that's not out of the realm of research psychology that exists now. It's just that it's interesting. The psychologists that understand about this are not empirically oriented in terms of research design. And so the people that have really got the high-powered research abilities have been educated in systems that don't really look at this kind of phenomenon. And I think we could get some research going that would test this stuff and just kind of look at what happens when people get looked at in a certain kind of way that could be identified as empathic. Well, some of that Rogerian research may be related to this. Some of that old Rogerian research on positive regard may be related to this, but it didn't talk about the eyes. It would be very interesting to have somebody doing research about the way the self feels being looked at. Self-psychologists talking about this today. I just got back, thank God, Sunday before Tuesday from San Francisco. We had a big self-psychology conference in San Francisco in which they were talking about the current Freudians are now beginning to look at this thing about having people be on the couch where they can't be seen. And they're beginning to wonder about what happens to somebody that needs to be looked at when you put them on the couch and they can't see your eyes. And I'll tell you, that's quite an achievement when Freudians really, I'm serious. When you start listening to them talk about things that Adler and Jung talked about 50 years ago, real interesting. Yeah.
Do we have any idea whether imprinting requires gaze back?
Well, did you hear that question? There's this guy, Eugene de Quille, who is a neurophysiological researcher at the University of Pennsylvania. In his book, The Spectrum of Ritual, look at the book, The Spectrum of Ritual, and look at his essay in this volume I edited of Zygon on ritual and human adaptation. De Quille suggests, he's a psychiatrist researcher of the University of Pennsylvania, he suggests that indeed that blessing, rituals of blessing, somehow are related to this imprinting business. And that there is actually some sort of changes in the psychological functioning of the human animal related to this imprinting behavior that has to do with what humans have talked about as blessing. So look at de Quille's work on that. I think it does. In other words, it's like you can't beam down into being human if you hadn't got somebody looking at you right. It's almost like the teleporter mechanism to get you down out of the archetypal is a certain kind of gaze. Yeah.
In at least Vipassana Buddhism that I'm familiar with, after you go through this process of cleansing and enlightening and empowering yourself, it really serves as base one to then allow you to give out metta, which is the blessings. And you give metta to everyone, to the universe. And you require the ability to transmit that energy of blessing.
You hear what he's saying? He's talking about in certain form of Buddhism, and I think many forms of Buddhism. If you really get to the heart of Buddhism, it's about this stuff. Because there are so many Buddhists that are trying to embody blessing and feel like that's the way the earth will be healed. And you know, in a way, that's right. And you can see if you say, well, now, the Buddhists think that if you really pass out blessing, you'll get a world with justice and peace. All right. That's the way it's set up archetypally. Think about, we've got to draw this to a close, and then we will come back and talk about the the slip between the cup and the lip on this. Next week we'll talk about how hard it is to get this thing tuned. But this idea of passing out blessing is very interesting. That is key to a lot of Native American traditions. They are so into this blessing business, and they have trouble understanding people that are not. They don't, and if you study a lot of these old traditions, they home in on that thing, and it's related to the eyes. In Hindu traditions, we'll stop with darshan. Somebody tell us what darshan is? Yes.
It's a Sanskrit word that means gaze or glance, and I've experienced it. It's a very ancient spiritual practice in which the person on the spiritual path comes to the teacher, and it's something like spiritual direction. You don't say anything; you just sit there and get what you get.
That's right. See, archetypally, the guru is not the magus there. You see, the magician part, you're doing ritual leadership in some sort of form. He is in the king position there. He's sitting on the dais. He's uplifted. The guru is on a platform where everyone in the room can see. And you look into the guru's eyes. And people who've experienced this can report feeling the energy coming into them. Well, I don't think that's a bunch of cultist nonsense. What that is doing is relating to this wound in us. That somebody will look at us and obviously communicate that I am not ashamed of you. When I look at you, I don't feel shame, and I don't feel embarrassment when I look at you. And in a way, what is being communicated there, and this gets me back around to the opposite of sola deo gloria. It is the true king who is saying, oh, you're so glorious. You're so glorious, and I see you. That's the true king. See, it's not his majesty, get it? It's not, to the true king, it's not his majesty. It's your majesty.
Is it like that phrase in the baptism of Jesus, where it says, this is my beloved?
Absolutely. This is my beloved son, in whom I am well. And if a man gets to the point in his life where he can even sometimes let that flow through him to somebody else, he's really getting close to initiation. Because it is that, see, all that remind me, you talk about how this relates to the Lucifer myth of Satan. Because the son in whom the Father is not well pleased turns real destructive. Okay, thanks a lot. That's all.
Are you interested in knowing if you embody the King in His fullness? Or if you're influenced by its more shadowy aspects? Why not take the Masculine Archetypes test? It's absolutely free and can guide you on a path of self-exploration. By gaining a deeper understanding of your personal masculine energies, you'll discover your strengths and identify areas where you can grow. Take the Masculine test today at masculinetest.com.